Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the living room. My name is Dr. Ethel James, though many people simply know me as Dr. J. To everyone returning, please allow me to say thank you for continuing this journey with me. And if this is your first visit to the Legacy Rising conversation, I genuinely am glad that you're here, and I want to invite you to come on in, sit down, let's talk. In our last conversation, we examined faith, leadership, and that mystical space between. And we talked about what it means to remain spiritually grounded, emotionally intelligent, contextually wise, and fully aligned without imposing ourselves on others or concealing the foundation from which we actually live. We established that wisdom may change how we communicate from room to room, but integrity requires that our foundation remains unchanged. And so today, however, I want to move the conversation inward because even after we understand that we do not have to divide our faith from our leadership, there's still another struggle many people carry quietly. And that struggle is the fear that perhaps the problem is not the environment. Perhaps the problem is us. And maybe I'm too intense or too ambitious, too emotional, too intelligent, right? Or too outspoken. Maybe you thought to yourself, maybe I'm too spiritual or curious or passionate or driven or sensitive or even too discerning and too confident, or here's one, too complicated, too gifted, or too much. Many people have never spoken those words publicly, but they have organized their lives around them because they enter into rooms already calculating how much of themselves will be acceptable. They consider the audience before deciding whether to speak, and they reduce the size of the idea before sharing it. They soften the conviction before expressing it, and then they minimize the achievement before anyone else can accuse them of pride. They hide the pain so no one will call them, weak, and they restrain the joy so no one will call them too excessive. They dim their brilliance so no one will feel, threatened. And eventually, what happens is they become highly skilled at being present without being fully seen. So today, I want to ask a question that may challenge the way you have interpreted your life. What if you're not too much? What if you have simply spent too much time measuring yourself by environments that did not possess the capacity, the language, the maturity, or willingness to understand what you carried? What if you were not difficult? What if you were discerning? And what if you were not overly emotional? What if you were just deeply aware? What if you were not demanding? What if you had standards? What if you were not intimidating, but what if your clarity exposed insecurity and people who had not yet learned how to stand securely behind it or even beside it? What if your vision was not unrealistic? What if it simply extended beyond the limits of those you asked to validate it? Now, let me be clear about something though, right? That does not mean every ounce of feedback you have ever received was wrong. It doesn't mean that every reaction to you was rooted in jealousy, and it does not mean you never need correction. It doesn't even mean that being gifted excuses poor communication and arrogance and disorder or emotional volatility and or disregard for others. Maturity requires examination, and accountability and self awareness is crucial. But examination is different from erasure, right? Growth is different from shrinking. Correction is different from condemnation. And humility is not the same thing as pretending you have nothing significant to offer. Smaller. Hmm. I could kind of go on and on and on and on and on about that because that's learned behavior. Most people do not decide, one morning to disappear. Shrinking usually happens gradually. Just think about it this way. A child raises her hand repeatedly because she knows the answer. Someone calls her a know it all. I've been there, I've experienced that. She raises it less because of that conditioning. What about maybe a young man expresses emotion and someone tells him to toughen up? We see this every day, and so he learns to conceal what he feels. A woman speaks with conviction, and oftentimes they say, she's aggressive. But the fact of the matter is, someone turns around and describes her as aggressive, and she begins cushioning every single sentence with an apology. A leader in a room introduces, a bold idea, and the room laughs before understanding it. And then the next time that particular leader, instead of offering their suggestions or their recommendations or even considering their ideas, they shut down and they say nothing. A person shares a spiritual conviction and someone dismisses them as overly religious. And then they begin editing the source of their wisdom. Maybe a visionary talks about what they see and people tell them to be realistic. And eventually they stop describing the future and begin merely tolerating the present. These are the moments that may look small from the outside, but repeated experiences become internal instructions. Do not speak too strongly. Do not feel too deeply. Do not dream too visibly. Do not celebrate too openly. Do not ask for too much. Do not occupy too much space. Do not make anyone uncomfortable with the fullness of who you are. I experienced that firsthand. And even back then, I didn't even understand what was going on. And because belonging is a legitimate human need, many people comply. They learn the language of acceptability, and they become agreeable when they should be honest, and silent when they should be courageous, and visible when they should be, accountable for their influence. They call it maturity. They call it peace. They call it humility. They call it keeping the relationships. But sometimes it's fear wearing respectable clothing. Right? Sometimes it is self abandonment disguised as wisdom, and sometimes it's a person making themselves easier to receive by becoming harder to recognize. Think about it. Whoa. Hmm. When I think about this, I think about so many people who silence themselves. And in that silencing of themselves so that they can become accepted, but then they no longer recognize themselves when they look in the mirror. And so I would say to you that there is a particular exhaustion that comes from being praised for a version of yourself that is incomplete. Because people may love the version of you that never asks for help. They may even celebrate the version of you that always says yes, and they may admire the version of you that remains calm while privately falling apart. They may even depend upon the version of you that solves everyone's problems. And I know people who do that. They may compliment the version of you that is endlessly available to them, emotionally controlled, spiritually strong, and professionally excellent. But what happens when that version is costing you your truth? I want you to examine that because that's a real question for you to ask yourself. What happens when people know your youthfulness but not your humanity? What happens when people recognize your performance but not your personhood? What happens when you become indispensable to everyone except yourself? There are people who feel deeply loved and completely unseen at the same time. And it's not because no one cares about them, but because, the version receiving the love is the version that they created to remain acceptable. And that is a very painful kind of fragmentation, to be surrounded and still hidden, to be known for what you provide and unknown in what you carry. I need you to think about that, right? Because what we're saying is You are known for what you provide, yet unknown in what you carry. Is this resonating with anyone? Right? To have a voice that serves everyone else while rarely saying what you need, right? To be able to lead people toward freedom while quietly negotiating your own captivity. And sometimes the hardest truth is this. My tongue today, right? Other people may have benefited from your shrinking. Your silence may have protected someone else from accountability. Your overfunctioning may have allowed others to underfunction. Your refusal to establish boundaries may have made access to you convenient, and your habit of minimizing your needs may have made relationships easier for people who did not want to reciprocate. Your willingness to remain unseen may have allowed insecure people to remain comfortable. Now, that does not necessarily make them evil, but it does mean your shrinking may have become part of a system. And when you begin to change the system, they resist. Shrinking. Hmm. Well, there are lots of things that actually happens when we stop shrinking, right? The moment we you begin talking and taking yourself seriously, some people will call you different. They say, "Wow, you've changed," right? When you begin to establish a boundary, someone may call you selfish because you're not freely giving your time like that they're accustomed to. When you stop over explaining, someone may call you distant. And you know what? Distance is sometimes necessary and sometimes it's required. Even when you speak clearly, someone may call you difficult. When you stop volunteering for every single burden, someone may question your commitment to their vision, their goal. And when you acknowledge your strengths, someone may even go as far as calling you arrogant. When you refuse access to what was never stewarded well in the first place, someone may accuse you of changing. And the truth of the matter is, they may be right. They are right. Think about it because you are changing. You are no longer participating in your own disappearance. You are no longer making yourself smaller to preserve relationships that require your absence in order to remain comfortable. You are no longer confusing availability with love, and you are certainly no longer confusing silence with peace. No longer confusing exhaustion with faithfulness, no longer confusing being needed with being valued. And I will say, as as I think through that transition, it can feel lonely. And I mean very lonely because what you thought people could understand about who you are and what you carry turns out that they don't know. Because the version of you that is becoming free may disrupt the expectations built around the version of you that survived. But the truth of the matter is that disruption is not always destruction. Sometimes disruption is the evidence that unhealthy agreements has ended. Whoa, too much for whom? Where is my bell, ladies and gentlemen? Because I don't even know if you can hear that because sometimes the pitch is too high. But whenever you hear yourself, or think of yourself as I'm too much, I want you to stop and pause, right? And I want you to get a new thought because I want you to ask a more precise question. And that question is too much for whom? Too much for a person committed to misunderstanding you? I've been around those individuals. Too much for an environment that rewards conformity. Too much for someone who only values you when you are convenient. Too much for a relationship that requires you to silence your needs and not ask for what you require. Too much for a leader threatened by independent thought. Ooh, we can develop that. like big time. Okay, too much for a system that maybe that prefers compliance over contribution. They would rather you not say anything. They want you to fall in line, right? Too much for people who have, decided that your confidence must be arrogance because they do not know how to interpret a woman who no longer apologizes for her authority. That question, too much for whom, is important because too much is rarely an objective measurement. It is often relational, and we call it like a relational judgment because one person may experience your depth as overwhelming and another may experience it as refreshing. One environment may consider your questions disruptive, another may recognize them as innovation. Okay, and one leader may even resent your discernment, but another may regard it as invaluable. One audience may reject your honesty, and another may feel relieved that someone finally said what everyone else was thinking, but too afraid to acknowledge. And this is why you cannot build identity entirely from reaction because people respond to us through the lens of their own experiences, the lens of their own wounds, the lens of their own expectations, and we'll develop that one day too. The lens of their own capacity or even culture and preferences and maturity. Now, what we will say is that feedback deserves consideration from each person, but reaction is not revelation. And why am I saying that? I'm saying that because someone's discomfort does not automatically become God's correction. Oh, did I say that out loud? I think I did. I did. Mm-hmm. Someone's inability to understand you does not become evidence that you are wrong. Someone's rejection does not become proof that you actually lack value. Discernment, it requires us to ask questions. Is this correction? Is this incompatibility, or is this projection? Because I know people who have a tendency to project their feedback onto others, things that they have to correct, things that they need to change. They'll project it on you to make you feel, so just jack you all the way up. Right. And then you have to ask, is this resistance? Is this an area where I need to mature? We ask all of those questions. Or is this an environment where I have been attempting to gain permission to become someone I was already called to be? Think about it, ladies and gentlemen. Woo. Humility is not invisibility. That's a really good one. Right? And this, I would say to you, if I were to have this open dialogue, I would say this is especially important for people of faith because many believers have been taught, an incomplete version in my assessment of humility. Let me just make sure I put that in there because I don't want anybody trying to come for me, right? Don't come for me unless I send for you. Right? But they have learned to deny their strengths, to deflect every compliment, hide their ambition, distrust visibility, or even fear influence and apologize for confidence. But humility does not require dishonesty. So, what am I saying? I am saying to you that if God gave you a gift, acknowledging it does not dishonor him. Pretending it does not exist does not make you humble. It makes you an inaccurate steward. Oh, Dr. J, did some, no, right. What am I getting at? I'm saying that humility is not saying I have nothing. Humility says what I have was entrusted to me, right? And I am responsible for how I use it. Humility does not erase capacity, it submits capacity. Humility does not deny influence, it refuses to worship influence. Are you catching what I'm saying here? Humility does not require you to disappear, it requires you to remember who the glory belongs to when you are seen. So let me think about this. If I were to use an example, right? If you have a light, right? Everybody has light, and we know, okay. But the purpose of light is not to draw attention to itself. Think about this. The purpose of light is to reveal what darkness concealed, but light cannot fulfill that purpose while apologizing for shining. You, did you just pick up what I put down? Right? Visibility becomes dangerous when it exists only to feed the ego. Visibility becomes stewardship when it helps people see, understand, when it helps people heal, when it helps people to grow, to build, or even become. So the question is not merely, do I want to be seen? Because there are some people that's their own motive, that's their ego. I just want to be seen. But the question is, what becomes possible for others when I stop hiding? Who receives the language because you finally speak? These are greater questions. Who receives courage because you finally stand? Who receives permission because you stop apologizing? Who recognizes possibility because your life becomes visible evidence? And who remains trapped if you continue mistaking obscurity for humility? There are assignments that require visibility, not celebrity, not performance, just visibility. And you cannot people lead people who cannot locate your voice. You cannot lead people that way if your voice is silent. You can't serve audiences that do not know your work even exists. You cannot become evidence while remaining committed to disappearance. These questions, these thoughts, they must be addressed. They must be considered. They must be processed. They must be chewed so that when you come forward and understand the difference between fullness and excess, you're able to let your light shine. Now, fullness and excess. Let me make an important distinction. Okay, being fully yourself. It does not mean expressing every thought in every setting. Because sometimes people have to recognize that what goes in does not necessarily need to come automatically out of your mouth. Any thought that you have does not necessarily mean you need to say it. It doesn't mean that every emotion must be acted upon. It doesn't mean every gift must operate simultaneously either, although for some people that is the case. But it does not mean every idea deserves immediate execution. And it certainly does not mean every room must accommodate every dimension of you in the same way. That's not fullness. That literally can become excess. Now, what fullness is governed, excess is unmanaged. Fullness knows its identity, excess demands attention, and fullness possesses discernment. Excess lacks timing, but fullness understands context, and excess ignores impact. Fullness is secure enough to listen, to actively listen, but excess must dominate the conversation, must dominate the atmosphere. And fullness can adjust its expression without abandoning its essence. Without abandoning. Yeah, I said it like that. Someone told me I was a fast talker, and it's not such that I'm a fast talker. I just manage my pace. And so when I said abandoning, it kind of rolled together. But excess assumes that any limitation is rejection. And this is where we're back to a term, right? Where emotional intelligence becomes necessary. Because emotional intelligence, if you recall that I said, and I've been saying it over the last 3 weeks, if you will, emotional intelligence helps us understand how we are affecting the room, how we are actually showing up. It helps us to regulate expression. It helps us to be able to actively listen and to understand that authenticity without consideration can become self-centeredness. Emotional intelligence is powerful in that it teaches us that being honest, it does not excuse being harmful. And then we partner that with spiritual intelligence. And spiritual intelligence, it helps us to discern whether this is the moment to speak, to wait, to build, to address, to withdraw, or even remain still. Spiritual intelligence asks whether expression is being led by purpose or driven by impulse. So when I ask, what if you are too much? I'm not encouraging an unexamined celebration of every behavior. What I am doing is asking whether you have mislabeled your God given fullness because you have not yet learned how to govern it. A powerful gift without discipline can become destructive. But the answer is not to destroy the gift, the answer is to develop the steward. Woo! Talk about this one, the burden of the multi-gifted person. Listen, I remember having a conversation with a young lady recently, and I was telling her, I recall so many times where someone said to me on multiple occasions, or different people said to me on multiple occasions, you need to get somewhere and sit down. You're doing too much, and all those types of things. But I began to understand something because I read in my favorite book, and of course, if you haven't figured it out, it's the Bible. But what I read was that Jesus gave one talent, he gave one 5 talents, and he gave one 10 talents. And so I was, blessed to receive 20. But I used to allow people to literally put their mouth on me to cause me to be discouraged, right? But there, because what I'd begun to understand is that it was only the person that received 1 talent that didn't provide an ROI. The person that received 5 talents doubled it. The person that received 10 talents doubled it. Now, of course, we can look at it, and biblically, of course, talent was the currency of the day. But my point is, they didn't sit down with what was given to them. They didn't go have several seats because of what was given to them. They understood instinctively that what had been given by the master, by the superior one, by the almighty Yeshua the Christ, that there was an expectation of a return. And so I began to understand that there is a particular tension that comes with carrying more than one strong gift. And people often understand specialization more easily than they do integration. They understand, of course, the author, the trainer, the minister, the strategist, the entrepreneur, the mentor, the speaker, all of the other titles, right? They become confused when one person carries all of them. And I've dealt with that for years. And when others appear confused, the multi gifted person may begin distrusting their own design. Why can I not choose one thing? Why do ideas keep coming? Woo, imagine that, right? Why do multiple assignments feel equally authentic? And why does my mind connect areas that other people can't, they keep them separate? Right? They literally will take them and keep them separate and say, this stays in this lane and this stays in that lane. Why do I feel limited by categories that appear to work for everyone else? And perhaps because you were not designed merely to occupy a category. Think about that. Perhaps you were designed to create connections, right? Because some people are specialists and others are integrators. And that's important for us to know because some of us build one room with extraordinary depth and others understand how the rooms connect, but neither is superior. But confusion, it begins when an integrator attempts to imitate a specialist, or a specialist is pressured to carry an ecosystem. The real responsibility is not to become what the marketplace understands most easily. The responsibility is to understand your own assignment clearly enough to communicate it without confusion. Being multi gifted does not excuse fragmentation. And if we think about this, in fact, it actually requires greater discipline. You're going to need structure and sequence and priorities and boundaries and language and timing. And you need to know which gift is required now and which one must remain developed, undeveloped, or remain developed but dormant for another season. You need the courage to honor the whole without activating everything at once. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is stewardship. And that may be one of the reasons you all, you have felt like too much, right? Because you were carrying several legitimate dimensions without a governing order. And the answer was never self rejection, the answer was alignment. Ooh, pardon me. I feel like when we talk about that, what if too much is unhealed pain? First of all, I would say we must also be honest enough to examine the places where our intensity may be carrying injury. That's a bell ringer, right? Because sometimes what we have a tendency to call passion is really anxiety. What we call discernment is some can come across sometimes as suspicion, and what we call directness is unprocessed anger. Sometimes what we call independence is fear of disappointment. hmm And many of you know that very well. What we call high standards, sometimes is perfectionism attempting to protect us from shame. And what we call leadership is control. Sometimes what we call strength is an inability, let me put it that way, to receive care. And sometimes what we call spiritual sensitivity is vigilance shaped by trauma. Let that sit down. Let that sit down because that's huge. That's mega. And this is why the question cannot simply be, am I too much? It must also be, what does the expression carry? What is this gift? Is this my gift? Is this my wound? Is this my conviction or my fear? Is it my strength, my defense? Is it Holy Spirit leading me? Or is this my nervous system trying to protect me? Wholeness requires the courage to tell the difference. And God does not heal us by erasing our personality. Whoever thought that, whoever taught that, whoever tried to make that, stick, God heals what has distorted it. And healing does not make a passionate person indifferent. It makes a passionate a person clearer, right? Healing does not make a discerning person naive, and it makes discernment less fearful. Healing does not make a strong person weak, and whoever told you that, tell them to go think again. It makes strength safe. Healing does not make a visionary ordinary. It releases vision from the pressure to prove worth. So if I'm looking at this, I'm going to say perhaps you're not too much, but perhaps some of what you carry needs healing. Perhaps maybe it needs maturity or even structure or language so that your fullness can become fruitful rather than exhausting. Okay? And that is not rejection, that is actually refinement, at least according to what I see. The question beneath the question, and the question is, what if I'm too much? Or am I too much? The deeper question is often, will I still be loved if I stop reducing myself? Will people remain if I establish boundaries? Will I belong if I speak honestly? Will I be accepted if I stop performing? Will I be safe if I become visible? Will I be punished if I succeed? And will people misunderstand my confidence? And I assure you they will. Will they leave if I need something too? And the question we ask also is, will God still be pleased with me if I desire more? And those are not shallow questions. They are questions about attachment, about identity and safety and worth and belonging. And no motivational phrase can resolve them by itself, because to resolve those things, it's going to require truth. And sometimes grief and repentance and healing, sometimes even difficult conversations, which people have a tendency to avoid. Right? Difficult conversations requires vulnerability. It requires transparency, and sometimes leaving environments that only know how to love your youthfulness. Sometimes it's learning to receive affirmation without suspicion from people who genuinely want to give it to you. Sometimes it means learning that rejection hurts, but does not have the authority to redefine who you are. Sometimes understanding that people can disagree with you without diminishing you, and sometimes accepting that becoming fully yourself may change who can accompany you into the next season. Because not everyone you loved, not every person who loved your survival, not every person who was a part of your survival will actually understand your transformation. Not everyone who benefited from your silence will celebrate your voice. Some people come to just, intentionally snatch your voice. Not everyone who knew you before alignment will know how to relate to you after your alignment, after you have a structure, after you have a foundation. But your responsibility, because we do have responsibility in this, your responsibility is not to remain familiar at the expense of becoming faithful. Hmm, that's a good one. Because that's a good one for so many different reasons. But I do know this, that if we're talking about becoming digestible or not being required to become digestible to everyone, there is a pressure in modern culture to become instantly understandable. Okay, your message must fit in a sentence. Your work must fit in a niche. Look at what has happened. We've been conditioned. Your identity must fit into a category. Your value must become immediately marketable. Clarity matters. And so when it comes to confusion, confusion does not create friction, but clarity does not require you to become shallow either. Right? You can communicate simply without being simple. You can be accessible without becoming diluted. You can meet people where they are without remaining where they are. You can translate depth without abandoning it. And not everyone will understand you immediately. And that's okay. Believe me, it's okay. And when you learn that it's not okay, your life will change. Your thought processes will shift. And then again, the minute you begin to believe that is the moment that other people will believe it too. Because some ideas require relationships, some assignments require time. Some people will meet one dimension of you, right? And they may meet one dimension of your work and then discover that, the rest of who you are later. But here's the goal. The goal is not universal comprehension. Not for everyone. The goal is faithful communication. You are responsible for clarity. You are not responsible for controlling every interpretation. You're responsible for character. You are not responsible for making everyone comfortable with your calling. You are responsible for stewardship. You are not responsible for becoming small enough to avoid feedback. What if, hmm, my fullness is the evidence? Now, that aligns a lot with what I have coming up and going on for 2027. Well, what if my fullness is the evidence? Hmm, what do you say? Because perhaps the qualities you have been hiding are connected to the people you are called to serve. Perhaps your depth is for the person tired of shallow answers, or your directness is for the person who needs clarity, or even your compassion is for the person accustomed to being overlooked, and even your intelligence is for the system that needs a new solution. Perhaps your faith is the moment when someone needs hope, or your story is for the person who believes recovery is impossible, or even your voice, and I'm so passionate about our voice, is for the room where silence has become harmful. And perhaps, even as we think further, your presence is for the person who needs to see what becoming looks like. Legacy requires evidence, and sometimes the evidence is a person who has stopped apologizing for surviving, for the person who has stopped apologizing for healing, for growing, for leading, for becoming, not because they believe they are superior to anyone, but because they finally understand that they are responsible, right? Responsible for the voice, for the gift, for the influence, for healing, even for the opportunity, for what becomes possible when they stop hiding. The possibilities are endless. Think about it. And so again, remember, my questions are not to make you feel like you're being attacked. They are to draw you in, to give you an opportunity to give some thought to it, so that when you speak about these things, that you are able to speak intelligently and not just from off the cuff. You are able to digest these questions, so that you are doing some introspection, some introspection, retrospection, all of those things. And so let me ask you this, because I ask this in many of the classes and the many conversations that I have with those that I'm coaching, that I'm mentoring, that I'm training. Who first taught you that you were too much? That question is so important for you to consider, because somewhere along the line, someone planted the seed. Someone said to you, and perhaps it wasn't the first time that the seed got really planted. Maybe the next time a person said it to you. Maybe it was the third time, but the seed was still already there. And then after the second and the third and the fourth time, it started germinating and growing, and you started believing what was being spoken into you, because you didn't have language for what was actually going on inside of you, because it was a God-given gift, multi-dimensional human being you are. Who told you that? And what caused you to grab a hold of it, to let it germinate and grow, for you to become a person that began to believe it, to embrace it, to the point that you started regurgitating it yourself? So you have to ask, was it spoken directly? Or did you learn it from the way people responded when you became visible? Ask yourself, what parts of yourself do you edit before entering certain rooms? Hmm. Work, home, church, friendships, all of those things. What compliments make you uncomfortable because you were taught that acknowledging strength is pride? Where have you confused being needed with being loved? These are our questions. And you might say, well, no, they're not hard for me. Well, maybe you've already done the work. But now I ask you this question: what boundary are you afraid to establish because the current version of the relationship may not survive it if you establish boundary breaking rules and guidelines. What, right? That's the question. What gift have you actually neglected because someone else did not know how to receive it? OMG. These are questions that you must ask yourself. Where have you interpreted incompatibility as personal failure? Mm, that's a deep question. That has depth that can be discovered, can be explored. It has an opportunity for you to even grow in that question. Okay, what part of your intensity needs healing? Mm, I'm still looking at the light bulbs, right? What part needs discipline? Those are real questions. What part needs language? And that's most of the time. There are parts of you that need language that you don't know how to. You don't have the words to articulate. And then you go even further to ask yourself, what parts of you needs permission? Ask, what would change if you stopped asking, how do I become easier for everyone else to receive? And you started asking yourself, how do I become responsible for the fullness God entrusted to me? Ask those questions because they will set you free. So let me ask you, what if you are not too much? What if you're just simply unfinished? What if you are powerful but still learning governance? What if you are gifted but need structure? What if you are discerning but need healing? What if you are visionary but need patience? What if you're called but still need preparation? What if the answer is not reduction? What if the answer is refinement? Because you do not have to amputate your gifts to become mature. You do not have to deny your ambition to become humble. You do not have to conceal your faith to become credible, and you do not have to suppress emotion to become strong. Nor do you have to abandon your voice to become safe. You do not have to disappear to prove you are submitted to God, but you do have to become accountable for what you carry. You have to learn, right? Its purpose. You have to learn its timing, its limits, its language, its responsibility, and you also have to learn its proper room. What am I saying? I'm saying this because fullness without stewardship, it becomes chaos. Trust me, I know, right? But fullness under alignment, it becomes legacy. And perhaps the issue was never that you were too much. Perhaps the real issue was that you were trying to pour your fullness into environments, into relationships and systems and expectations that were never designed to define you. There's my bell, right? Perhaps you have been using the reactions of limited rooms to measure an unlimited God. Perhaps you've been asking people for permission to become what heaven already authorized, and perhaps today is the day that you become louder. Perhaps it's the day you become clearer about who you are, clearer about what requires healing, what requires discipline, what must no longer be hidden, what you are responsible to steward. Because the goal is not to prove that you are not too much. The goal is to become so aligned that you no longer need another person's discomfort to answer that question for you. And perhaps, just perhaps, that is why you found your way here. Perhaps something in you has known that shrinking was no longer sustainable. The version of you that kept everyone comfortable can no longer carry that particular assignment ahead. Perhaps you're not being called to become a different person. Perhaps you're being called to stop abandoning the person God has already been developing all along. Not uncorrectable, not unaccountable, not self exalting, but whole, grounded, visible, faithful, and ready. Thank you for the gift of your time and the opportunity to serve you with excellence. Thank you for investing in this time with me. Thank you for trusting me with your attention. And thank you for gathering with me again in the living room. Now, I don't want you to rush away from the question that this conversation has raised. Do me a favor. I want you to sit with it. I want you to pray about it, journal about it, and ask yourself honestly, what part of me have I mislabeled because I was viewing myself through someone else's limitations? And I want you to also ask, what would responsible fullness look like in this season of my life? And once you've taken the time to actually answer that question, I want you to do me another favor. I want you to share this conversation with someone who has spent years reducing themselves to remain acceptable, someone who needs to know what healing and discipline and humility do not require disappearance, that they can learn more about themselves and be present. You can learn more about me, my books, and all of my books, right? My leadership work, my speaking training, Legacy Rising, and the other rooms within the house at dretheljames.com. I want to invite you back next week. Why? Because next week, we're going to bring this first month of Legacy Rising Conversations into focus with finding your room. Because once you stop believing that you are too much, the next question becomes, where do I begin? And you do not have to enter every room at the same time. You only need enough clarity to recognize which room is calling for your attention now. All right. So until then, my name is Dr. Ethel James, of course, strategically known as Dr. J. And the living room is always open. I'm inviting you always to come in, to sit down. Let's talk. And I'll see you next Wednesday. God bless and good night.